In this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what we suggest you do to manage thinning this year in 2022, but also talk about the future and where we hope we're going to get to in the next few years, bringing computer vision into the equation to try to help us accomplish thinning in a precise way. So just as a review, precision crop load management is a strategy or a series of strategies to try to manage the number of apples on each tree to an exact number to obtain the best possible outcome. And as we've mentioned many times before in presentations, there's really three opportunities to influence fruit number per tree, and that's through pruning. Each time we cut off a branch, we're throwing some buds on the ground. Secondly, through chemical thinning, starting at bloom and carrying all the way on to 18 to 20 millimeters. And then lastly, by hand thinning. In this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on the chemical thinning part of that three-pronged strategy to manage crop load. So the very first step in precision crop load management is you have to establish a target of the number of fruits you want to harvest from each tree. It sounds easy, but it's not as easy if you do it with a lot of thought. You have to identify this target or goal based upon fruit size and yield, and on the potential that that orchard has in the particular climate that you live in. I show here two pictures of orchards. The first one is an orchard of tall spindle that is fully developed. The canopy is tall, 11 to 12 feet tall, fully filled in. The second one is a equally aged orchard, but the canopy hasn't filled in, particularly in the top part of the tree. These two orchards have different potential in terms of the number of fruits that each tree should carry. So for in the first example, I said, I think that orchard could probably carry 1,200 bushels of Honeycrisp per acre at 80 count. And so at the spacing, which is 3 by 11, 1,320 trees to the acre, it should have 73 fruits. But the second orchard, because it's not filled in the upper part of the canopy as well, I said should only carry 800 bushels at 80 count fruit, same number of trees per acre, so it should carry only 48 fruits per tree. Every grower has to be realistic when they decide how many fruits the tree should carry. And we rely on your experience with that orchard and how well you feel it has filled its space to determine how many apples the tree should carry. Then when we come to the thinning period, we try to use the stepwise approach that I described in my previous talk to manage the thinning process, to stepwise reduce the number of fruit through sequential applications using the pollen tube growth model first, then the carbohydrate model and the fruit growth rate model to guide post-bloom thinning sprays and determine whether we want to reapply any spray or not. This is again the model that we tend to use and how we think about it logically going forward. I want to comment just briefly that bloom thinning, although it's not highly accepted in the eastern US yet, I think is essential. And I wanted to make a couple of comments about the two most common caustic chemicals that are used in bloom thinning. And Mike in his presentation talked about both of them. They both are caustic chemicals, meaning that they burn the pistil, the stigmatic surface of the pistil. They also are caustic in that they can result in mild leaf phytotoxicity, but ATS generally has very little effect on fruit finish, whereas lime sulfur also can have very little effect on fruit finish, but in wet years, it can result in some russetting. Both chemicals, to be successful, require 2 to 3 applications during that short period of 7 to 10 days during full bloom. But when these chemicals are used with the pollen tube growth model, you can do a substantial portion of the thinning job right then at bloom. Now, ammonium thiosulfate is not registered legally as a thinner. That would classify it as a pesticide, but it is a foliar nitrogen fertilizer, because it's an ammonium fertilizer. And so it can legally be used in New York State when you apply it not as a thinner, but as a foliar fertilizer, recognizing that a secondary effect is to thin some of the crop. We've shown repeatedly that it's very good in improving return bloom of Honeycrisp because it generally kills seeds or doesn't allow seeds to develop through fertilization so that we don't have as much GA produced by those seeds, which inhibit flowering. Lime sulfur has to have an oil penetrant mixed with it. We've done studies with lime sulfur alone and get very little thinning. But when oil is mixed with it, it is a potent thinner. And it seems to have more what I call reach back potential, that it can kill pollen tubes growing down the style better than ATS. Any oil will tend to work. We've tested several of them. Fish oil seems to give slightly better result than do other oils. And so we recommend that where you can get it. Plus, if you use a fish oil, you can use it in organic production. But it's not registered in New York. Even though it's registered as a fungicide, the current lime sulfur company labels prohibits its use during bloom. These are companies afraid of bad effects from sulfur. This is the product that is used almost 100% in Western orchards. They have great success with it, but they have drier weather, and so they don't get russeting. Here it works well when the year is dry, but it's problematic when the year is wet. This is some data we did many years ago. I just wanted to point out in an unthinned control, we had 288 apples on the tree with either ATS or lime sulfur with fish oil in this case. We dropped that down to 150 to 180 fruits. So they both thinned. Now, this was with no additional thinning sprays at all. At petal fall or 10 millimeters. This is strictly what we got out of the bloom thinning. And numerically, size was increased, but it was not significantly different. We compared in this study several different oils, fish oil and lime. Well, I wanted to compare fish oil and lime sulfur at full bloom versus ATS at full bloom, and it did not give any difference in thinning. They both thin similarly. When we looked at different oils, fish oil versus ultrafine oil versus vegetable oil versus regulated versus silhouette, there was no significant difference in thinning. However, the fish oil tended to give larger size in a couple of the cases compared to other oils. That data is still good. And we also saw in those studies back in 2004 when we did these trials with Honeycrisp that we tended to get more return bloom with Honeycrisp. And so you see here, an untreated control had only about 10% return bloom. Just the ATS at full bloom raised it up to about 45% return bloom. The standard sort of post-bloom chemical sprays of NAA or 7, Maxell and 7 tended to work fairly well, about similar to ATS. But when we combine Maxell and ATS, we got the best return bloom at 75%. That's led us to continue to recommend to growers to use ATS at bloom. Back in the days of 2004, we didn't have the pollen tube growth model, so we were just applying at 80% bloom. Now with the pollen tube growth model, we should be able to more precisely time them. But nevertheless, I want to emphasize that many growers come back to me and say that as soon as they started using ATS every year, they were able to finally control biennial bearing of Honeycrisp. Now, unfortunately, Mike did that first study in the Champlain Valley on a year with drought. And the drought did limit return bloom for many varieties, but especially Honeycrisp and Ida Red in New York. But I think in a more normal year, we'll see some consistent positive effects of ATS. And is one of the reasons why I prefer ATS over NAA at full bloom with Honeycrisp. Now you can spray any one of the 4 hormone type thinners at bloom. And I list here who, the Promelin types, the Maxell types, the Fruit Tone types, Amid-Thin, but they all are very mild thinners. And they don't tend to improve return bloom as much as ATS. So my suggestions for bloom thinning is use the pollen tube growth model. I think it's a great addition, but use ATS. That's really the only legal one in New York. If you're listening from another state where lime, sulfur, and oil is legal, you can spray that. And I like that particularly on biennial bearing varieties like Honeycrisp, Fuji, Evercrisp, and Delicious. However, for more annual varieties, I think you can do just almost as well with a hormone type thinner like Gala, Snapdragon, Empire, McCown, Pink Lady. Two cautions. We suggest you not spray the caustic thinners under slow drying and wet conditions, or if there's frost. Wherever you had frost, there's some damage to the wax layers of the fruit, and these chemicals get on the fruit underneath the wax and cause russetting. I want to now focus just on some of the options for post-bloom chemical thinners. For petal fall, the options are 7 alone, or amide thin alone, or Maxellin 7, or NAN 7, or Maxellin NAA. And in the near future, we hope this new chemical that's not yet labeled, but should be labeled in 1 to 2 years, called metametron. Its trade name will be named Brevis. The highlighted one, NAN7, is the one that I like the best out of all of those options. At the main thinning window of 10 to 12 to 13 millimeters, we generally use the combinations of hormone thinners and 7. So NAN7, Maxellin 7, Maxellin NAA. But in the near future, in fact, in 2022, a new product named ACC, which is trade named Exceed, will be available in several states as a fully registered product, but in New York, it probably will not receive New York label, so it will probably be sold and on a experimental use type of program. And the newer product, which is not available yet, called Metametron. For the last spray, if needed, we have struggled in the past to get any thinner to work when fruits are 15 to 20 millimeters. I put NAN7 on the list, but it almost doesn't do anything. The plant loses sensitivity to NAA very quickly once fruits pass 15 millimeters. But we've had better success with Maxellin 7 with a pint of oil mixed as a surfactant. That's where we've gotten the best thinning from this late timing. Ethyl, also with oil, can give thinning. But the real exciting thing is these two new products, ACC, combined with Maxell, or Metametron, both thin when fruits are big and will be great additions to our toolbox once we have them and learn how to use them. So for example, on Honeycrisp, I would suggest the following. Start with some 2 ATS sprays at bloom with 2.5%, then follow that with an NAN7 at petal fall based upon the carbon balance model, sometime between 100 and 130 degree days. Follow that with another spray of NAN7, slightly lower rate when fruits are 10, 11, 12, 13 millimeters. And if needed, then this Maxell 7 in oil for now, or this ACC plus Maxell or Metametron, which I think will be better than the standard Maxell 7 in oil. So for success in 22 and chemical thinning, I suggest the following. Every block needs a proper assessment of flower quality. How many spurs are flowery? Is it only 25? Is it 50%? Is it 75% or 100% of the spurs flowering? And then whether or not the king flower is present and undamaged or is missing. If king flowers are missing, then I don't like to blossom thin. I'd rather wait and attack it in petal fall and 10 millimeter. But if the kings are present, I think you have to blossom thin and generally use full rates, but follow the carbohydrate model. Time your thinning sprays based upon degree days, as we mentioned in the earlier presentation. And use the fruit growth rate model between each spray to assess the real impact of that thinning spray. Two little practical suggestions in number 3 and 4. I'd like to nozzle the sprayer differently for each spray. When we're spraying at bloom with ATS, for example, the goal is to have every flower on that tree get some ATS on the pistil itself to burn it. Therefore, I like to have uniform nozzling from the top to the bottom. But for the hormone type sprays at petal fall 10 millimeters and 18 millimeters, we tend to always overthin the bottom. So we start adjusting the amount of chemical applied to the different parts of the tree. So at petal fall, I like to nozzle it with only 1/3 of the spray chemical hitting the bottom half of the tree and 2/3 directed towards the top of the tree. But once we get to the 12 millimeter spray, I nozzle it even differently, where almost all the spray is in the top, very little in the bottom. And if we spray ever at the 18 millimeters, I spray only the top of the tree. Now, some growers like to use surfactants like Regulate, and Regulate with NAA makes a big difference. You can get much more thinning out of NAA with Regulate. But on the other hand, if you're spraying in kind of dangerous conditions and there's possible overthinning, you will get overthinning if you put Regulate in with NAA. Thus, I'd like to suggest a couple of rules. If with the carbohydrate model, there's no deficit predicted when you're going to spray, then I don't mind putting Regulate in. It probably will help you. But if there's a carbohydrate deficit predicted, I would never include Regulate in the mix. Oil is another surfactant that is very powerful, and the only time I think it's justified in the spray chemical thinning sprays is at the 18 millimeters with what we used to have available. With these two new chemicals, it will not be necessary to add oil on any of the sprays. I've talked repeatedly in the last year, but I emphasize for this audience that with Honeycrisp, we are expecting in 2022 a high bloom. And therefore, blossom thinning is essential for Honeycrisp because the ATS can reduce the number of seeds. And these excess numbers of seeds on a high bloom year is what causes biennial bearing because they produce gibberellins, which inhibit flowering. And blossom thinning is the best way to remove or kill those excess seeds before they cause damage. I will mention that an alternative, which a few growers in Washington do, is to hand thin at full bloom. Go out there by pinching out all the little flowers except one on every cluster. It's very time consuming, very expensive, but some people do it on vast acreages with an army of people because it is an absolutely sure way to eliminate biennial bearing on Honeycrisp. The reason why it's so important with Honeycrisp is its flower initiation happens very early in mid-June, whereas most of the other varieties, the flower initiation for the next year happens later in July or even early August. Therefore, early thinning, getting the fruit number down to the reasonable number, reducing total seeds on the tree to a reasonable number becomes very important with Honeycrisp. Now, we've recommended for many years return bloom sprays with NAA or ethyl. And this is a slide from a different presentation I decided to throw in just to make the point that because Honeycrisp blooms so early, or not blooms, sets its flower buds for next year so early, often when we spray these summer NAA or ethyl sprays, we're too late. So we're suggesting an earlier timing for these return bloom sprays. And on my last point on this slide, I have the recommendation. Start spraying ethyl at 10-day intervals when fruits are only 16 millimeters big. Used to be we waited till they were maybe 25 to 30 millimeters to start. But this earlier timing will help induce flowering on Honeycrisp trees. The risk is ethyl can thin at that time. Therefore, the second caution. The first two sprays should be at a moderate rate and should not be applied when temperatures are over 85 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to find a 2 or 3 day window when temperatures are moderate to put on these ethyl sprays. So a sort of spray program we would recommend for good flower formation and thinning of Honeycrisp would be start at bloom with 2 ATS sprays, then at petal fall with an NAA +7 spray, then at 8 to 12 millimeters, another NAA and 7 spray, and then beginning these 4 return bloom sprays of ethyl with a low rate on the first one when they're 15, 16, 17 millimeters, and then the higher rate for the later ones when they're 25, 35 or larger fruit size. The take-home messages in terms of crop load management are you have to remember that pruning is a piece of the puzzle. And we didn't talk about that in this presentation, but we suggest that you prune to a target bud number, but you wait till green tip or half-inch green so that you can see how many buds are on that tree and you don't prune a tree that has light bloom. But then to use the precision chemical thinning program we discussed, using 2 sprays of ATS followed by the pollen tube, using the pollen tube growth model to time it, then petal fall and other sprays guided by the carbohydrate model with an assessment of the results using the fruit growth rate model. Then apply these return bloom sprays starting at 16 millimeters and then hand thin as early as possible to get the fruit numbers down so that you can get flower bud initiation. I want to end with just some few slides and comments about where we're headed. This whole concept of precision crop load management starting to seem too complex, too much effort, takes too much time. So we've had a dream for a number of years if we could automate some of this using computer vision, robots, maybe it would not be so onerous. So we're working with several companies to develop autonomous vehicles with computer vision to run up and down the rows and count at different times of the season what is out there on a tree by tree basis. We think that if we count dormant buds, we can adjust pruning based on the number of dormant buds. If we count floral buds at green tip to pink, we can then come back and reprune or adjust pruning before bloom. If we count flowers at bloom, it will adjust our blossom thinning. And then fruitlets later will help us determine how close we are to the target number. A second piece that we're working on is trying to figure out a way to then convey information that this rover would acquire through computer vision back to the human worker. So I have a picture here of a Google Glass. We envision workers either wearing earbuds or something like this glass, in which as they approach each tree, information on that tree would be communicated them in audible form with earbuds or visually in Google Glass to tell them what to do in terms of pruning or in terms of thinning. Lastly, there's a picture of a tractor with a prototype smart sprayer in which we could drive it up and down the rows and it would hit certain clusters with, say, ATS or another caustic chemical to thin those and not hit others. And it would adjust it tree by tree by tree based upon the data that the rover would collect. So the focus of this project is to first assess how many buds are out there, how many fruitlets are out there, and then do something about it early in the season. And both guiding pruning, guiding chemical thinning, and guiding hand thinning. The problem that we have with our current protocols is it's time consuming and tedious. But secondly, when you count in the dormant season, it's hard to distinguish between floral buds and vegetative buds. But a third problem comes just from human fatigue. The accuracy of manual counts varies considerably from person to person and with the time of day. And we found that growers just quickly tire of all this manual counting. Now, second problem is that there's a lot of variability in an orchard. We tell people, go count 5 representative trees, but if you map that tree of how big all the trunks are in that acre, there's a whole range. Some are big, some are small. The bigger trunk trees should have more apples than the smaller trunk trees. And all the orchards look uniform. There is considerable variability. Thus, each tree should have a different optimum crop load. But if we can use this computer vision, we can record data from every single tree, store it, process it, and then hopefully communicate it back to the grower with this georeferencing of each tree to allow individual tree management. So that's where we hope we're headed with this big SCRI project. A rover has been built. It turns out there's about 3 other companies in the world that are similarly building ATV mounted sensors that can count. And we're trying to work with all of them to then build into their systems a way to not only acquire the information, but communicate it back to the grower. Lastly, I just mentioned that it's not so easy as it sounds. When you look at what the camera sees at different times, they're very different. And for a camera to identify pink flower clusters is very different from the camera to identify 20 millimeter fruits. And so you have to have very robust but distinct artificial intelligence guided computer vision at each time as we go through this thinning window. Now, we do think a lot about how are we going to communicate this back to growers. Now, at the simplest level, if we were to map the orchard with one of these rovers, we could produce a map like you see here on the left, showing areas of the orchard with higher bloom and areas with lower bloom. This is helpful. When a manager can get this kind of map, he can then try to figure out how to address it. But even better would be to convey actionable information to the human worker on the specific crop load management for a specific tree during both dormant pruning and hand thinning. And also to link that information to smart sprayers that would spray trees differently based upon the number of fruits that tree should have. Ultimately, it would be wonderful if we could have robots that would do the crop load management for us. And that's a long-term goal that may not happen in this current project. So with that, I'd be happy to answer questions, but I hope I've given you a sense of what to do in 2022 with the tools we have, but also what I hope that you'll have available to you in the next 3 to 4 years.